Hi, I'm Gordon Wettstein, Associate Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Stanford University and co-founder and chief scientist at Zinn Labs. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about what I think the future of the metaverse is going to look like, in particular the technology aspects of it. One thing we need to think about is how to gear this technology to generating truly human-centric experiences with these emerging XR devices. In order to understand how to generate human-centric experience, we first need to understand the user a little bit. So this typically involves understanding the eye and the visual perception of the user. Now, most people think about, designing a display that is close to your eye as something that caters only to the photoreceptors on your retina. And that is true. We need to understand the distribution and other properties of photoreceptors on the retina, but we equally need to understand how the lens in the eye accommodates and creates visually comfortable and perceptually realistic experiences by, this ability for our eyes to automatically focus to different depths. And we also can learn a lot from the ocular movements, the eye movements, saccades, fixations, and other types of eye movements that tell us a lot about the user and that help us generate better experiences. A big goal for XR, in my understanding, is to generate experiences that are indistinguishable from physical experiences. So think about it this way. If you put a digitally rendered teapot next to a physical teapot, can you tell which one is which? If the answer is no, then it would be perceptually realistic. But these experiences also need to be visually comfortable in the sense that they don't create eye strain and other visual discomfort. My friend Doug Landman and I came up with this idea of a visual Turing test a few years ago. And that's maybe a good analogy that we can use for the perceptual realism. You're probably familiar with the Turing test where, you can talk to somebody on a console, either a computer or a real person. And if you can chat with the computer in a way that you can't tell which one is the computer and the person, then that AI or that computer passes the Turing test. Now, again, this is the same analogy we're going to use here as a visual Turing test for displays. If the display is engineered in a way to give us perceptually realistic experiences, we have passed the visual Turing test for displays and all is good. But we're far from that, passing that test today. As I mentioned, studying eye movements is important. So we study those usually using eye tracking technology. For augmented reality in particular, it's really important to have low latency tracking systems that are very robust to a large part of the population, that operate at ultra low power and that are very accurate. So these are all different aspects of the technology that we have to take into consideration for these human-centric experiences. So in the next little while, I would like to tell you a little bit more about some of the research projects that we've been doing at Stanford in the lab that are geared towards these types of applications. So these are some emerging technologies in XR, and they include some display work, perceptually based rendering, and also some eye tracking technology. Let's start looking at some VR/AR displays. Now, if you think about a VR display, it's really an old school optical design that has been well known since the stereoscopes of the 1830s. So Wheatstone invented the stereoscope where you basically look at two photographs, one with each eye, and there's the stereoscopic viewing apparatus, the stereoscope, that helps you separate those two images for the different eyes. To some extent, today's VR displays operate on the same principle. Yes, they're digital. We can dynamically update the image. We can share these experiences online. We can interact with them through through controllers and many other props. But it's basically a stereoscope on steroids, if you want. The National Academy of Engineering of the US declared enhancing virtual reality a grand challenge of the 21st century. And it really is a grand challenge because it involves all aspects of computer science and electrical engineering to engineer these systems with the goal of creating better experiences for the user. And this is sometimes what people forget. Now, one aspect of VR displays today that can be improved and that is not quite right yet is their lack of focus cues. So what that means is a VR display today is typically comprised of a small display, something like, micro display, an OLED perhaps, and that's magnified by a lens. This is a simple magnifier design, and we can exactly predict where this virtual image will appear based on the focal length of the lens and the physical distance between microdisplay and lens. We can use the Gaussian thin lens formula you see on the left, and basically each eye of the user is looking at a plane floating in space in front of us. So this is not really natural. In the real world, our eyes accommodate or they focus at various different depths depending on how far away the object is. And this lack of focus cues has been a topic of great interest in the research and development community. Now, a lack of focus cues, which we see in today's VR displays, can lead to the vergence accommodation conflict, which is a perceptual mismatch of depth cues that the human brain uses, and it can cause nausea, eye strain, and other undesirable effects, basically visual discomfort. And that is concerning because we may want to use these devices for prolonged periods of time in the future. My lab has been working on a number of different technologies over the last few years, trying to address this lack of focus cues. We've been developing computational near-eye displays with focus cues, and I'll just give you a brief overview of some of the technologies we've been looking into, and they all have different benefits and disadvantages. For example, gaze-contingent varifocal displays use eye tracking and some mechanism to dynamically adjust a global focal plane. So you're basically going to track what the eye is looking at, how far away that object is, and you adjust the focal plane of the display to that distance. It's not quite natural because you still only have a plane, but at least you can update that plane dynamically. We published this in 2016, 2017 with large-scale user studies demonstrating that it's a really effective technology to drive the user's accommodation for young people. And Facebook has, or Meta now, has also publicly announced that they're working on similar types of technology for some of their VR headset prototypes, at least starting at the Oculus Connect in 2018. So these use mechanical motion or focus tunable lenses together with eye tracking. We've worked on near-eye light field displays. Light field displays is a way to project multiple different images into slightly different parts of the same pupil. This is something we've been publishing at SIGGRAPH and at other places over the years, and I closely work with Magic Leap, who commercialized this type of technology also for AR, and I co-founded another company called Raxium to develop micro LED technology to bring these and other capabilities to AR and VR displays. So we've been working on this light field display idea for a while, and it's interesting. But what we've been focusing on for the last few years in the lab is actually holographic displays. So holographic displays have been around for more than 60 years. Dennis Gabor won a Nobel Prize for the invention of holograms. And these displays haven't been quite practical yet, but they're getting very close now, and they offer unique capabilities for wearable displays. And this is something I'd like to dive into a little bit more. So let's take a closer look at what a holographic near-eye display is and what it may be able to offer. Some of you may have seen optically recorded holograms in the past. You can see these, for example, at the MIT Museum or many other places. So to record these, somebody actually set up a physical scene just like it, and then it's kind of captured like a photograph, but with a laser illuminating the scene. And the nice thing is that in a very thin photographic emulsion, you can capture all the 3D-ness of the scene with an extreme depth range, the large field of view where the viewer can move left and right in front of the display. And you can actually accommodate your eyes at different depths. So it's incredible what a hologram can do. But obviously, we don't want to record it optically because that's going to lead to a static hologram, like a printed photo that cannot be easily replicated. We want to do digital holograms that can show dynamic content. A digital holographic display kind of works like this. You have a laser or a coherent light source that illuminates the scene. There's typically some amount of optics that perhaps collimates the incident beam. There's a spatial light modulator, or SLM, which doesn't necessarily modulate the amplitude of the light, but it can delay the phase of the incident wave in a programmable per pixel manner. This wave field will continue to propagate in front of the SLM and create a target image or volume in a very small scale in front of this SLM. So these SLMs are small, maybe much smaller than a cell phone screen, just a few millimeters in diameter. But that's okay for AR and VR displays because we're going to use this eyepiece, the magnifying lens that I showed you earlier already, and that's going to magnify this image quite a bit. So when we look at this holographic volume or image as a user, we're actually going to see a very large image, and it's going to be 3D, which is nice because now we can accommodate our eyes freely in space without really having to do any mechanical motion, eye tracking, or using focus tunable lenses. The big question is then, given a target image or volume, what is the pattern that we're going to send to the SLM to delay this phase? It's actually a very challenging problem that it has been studied for decades. This is known as computer-generated holography. How do you generate a digital phase delaying pattern or phase pattern for an input image? But the big challenge that we've been tackling and that we've been facing when we started working on this is that typically these holographic images don't look very good. the quality is poor. We see lots of noise and speckle and blur. They don't look as good at all as what you would imagine from your modern OLED TV or your phone screen. And part of the reason, or maybe the primary reason for this poor image quality, is a mismatch between how people simulate these physical optical settings and what they actually do in practice. You can simulate whatever you want, but if there are small deviations between your simulated model that you use to calculate the phase patterns and the physical optical system, it leads to large deviation in image quality. And this can include, inequality or non-idealities of the source illumination. It can include nonlinear or difficult to model behavior of the SLM. It can include optical aberrations of the entire optical setup and many other effects. We've been developing a family of techniques that we call neural holography. Neural holography is an idea where we, solve computer-generated holography problems using modern artificial intelligence methods or AI methods. And, in a nutshell, one aspect of this is to take a camera and capture lots of pairs of phase patterns that you show on the SLM and resulting images that you can capture with the camera, focus at multiple different distances, which is illustrated here with these dashed lines. So we have lots of input-output pairs, and we can train neural network parameterized models that now try to approximate the physical optical setup better than your traditional simulated methods. Now, we don't just use black box neural networks to learn this wave propagation model. We actually start out with a simulated model that gives us a pretty good starting point of what actually happens. And this is called F sub ASM here. So the angular spectrum method tells us how coherent light propagates in free space from one plane to another or multiple planes. And we just learn the difference between the simulated model and our physical optical setup using, for example, these convolutional neural networks, CNNs, shown here on the bottom. So once we train this camera calibrated wave propagation model, we can now use it to generate phase patterns that give us a better image quality. And we can start with content that is either a 2D RGB image or maybe an RGBD image that has a depth map, maybe a 3D focal stack, or a 4D light field. All of these content types are supported by our models, and we can turn this now, any of this, into a single SLM phase pattern or a set of time multiplexed SLM phase patterns. Our setups sort of look like this. We have mostly worked with benchtop setups that you see here. They're not particularly small, although I'll show you one very small setup that we built recently. Typically, there's a laser here that I illustrated before. It has 3 diodes in it for RGB. They're all coupled into the same fiber and then are collimated by some standard collimating optics. Here's the phase SLM and a beam splitter cube that the SLM is reflective in this case, not transmissive. There's some additional optical system to filter out some of the higher diffraction orders and a camera to capture the results. And we can focus this camera at different depths to simulate the effect of the eye, sort of accommodating at different distances. So here I'm just moving my cell phone closer to the setup. We have a little porthole here that shows you that there's actually an image in there. We're now switching to the view from the actual machine vision camera that captures the content in color. And if you run your traditional computer-generated holography CGH algorithm on this 2D image showing some rodents from a funny movie, we see that the image quality is just not very good. And this is a pretty well-calibrated setup. And the reason is, again, as I said earlier, there's a mismatch between the wave propagation model used in simulation and the physical optical setup. So when we started working on this topic and developed the first method that used these modern AI techniques back in 2020, we were able to get image quality like this. And that was a big step forward, and people got very excited about this. People who've been working on holography for a long time got very excited about the potential of this methodology. Now, I should mention that only the image content in the white box is actually constrained. So the hologram cannot really block light. It can only redirect light through diffraction. So whatever's outside the white box is actually light that's directed outside of where we constrain the content. And so this is not unexpected, and we just show it here so that you know that these are all experimentally captured results. Like, I'm not going to show you any simulations. This is experimentally captured data. Capture videos looks pretty good. Doesn't look quite as good as your modern LCD or OLED yet, but this is a huge step forward from what people were able to do before over the last couple of decades. And we've entered a new age of neural network enabled and fueled computer-generated holography. Now, very recently at SIGGRAPH, we presented what's probably the best experimentally captured results for holography. Here we see a static 3D scene where the camera actually focuses back and forth. We get this really nice depth of field effect. We get very good image quality, very little speckle or other noise. So if you've ever worked on holography or seen other holograms, this will probably be the best results that you've seen. And again, these images are created by phase patterns displayed on the SLM that you can see on the left for RGB channels. You can do this by showing movie content that is 3D. So here we're just showing you a short clip of the movie sequence, and we're stopping the video and refocusing the camera. In this case, we used a MEMS-based phase SLM that is very fast. So we can use these time multiplexing capabilities, which help us naturally despeckle the results and achieve very good image quality. But the secret sauce for generating these high quality results is always the algorithms processing the data. Now, I mentioned that algorithms and wave propagation models are crucial for these types of setups to get good image quality. But I should also mention that holographic near-eye displays have a huge amount of potential to offer capabilities that no other micro display can offer for AR and VR. For example, a group from Meta Reality Labs in 2020, and more recently, a collaboration between my lab and NVIDIA Research has demonstrated the world's thinnest VR displays. Both of them are based on holographic displays, and both are just a few millimeters thick. Instead of having big goggle-like form factor, you can now go down to something that we call holographic glasses. So eyeglasses-like form factor for VR displays. So this thin form factor is something that's really enabling. These holographic displays have other benefits as being really light efficient. You can correct for people's prescription. You can correct optical aberrations in your system. There's just so many benefits that go beyond what any other display technology can do. So I'm really excited, and I think that this is a technology of the future for human-centric AR and VR of the future. Let me show you some things you can do with perceptually driven rendering. If you only understand a little bit more about the user, you can just generate a lot of better experiences, but without changing the hardware necessarily. So one aspect is, going back to the human eye again, is that we typically think about the eye as something that, rotates around the center somewhere. But it actually turns out that the center of rotation, C, so the eye will rotate around that, and the center of projection, which is basically the center point optically of your eye, N, are different. And what that means is that as our eye rotates in its socket to look at different parts of the scene, the center of perspective actually changes ever so slightly. And what that means is that there's a small amount of parallax, so depth-dependent shift of the image as we gaze around in the scene. So we call this, or this is called ocular parallax in the literature, in the vision science literature. And we developed a technique to track the eye and render this into the scene. Comes at no computational cost. That's extra on top of what you do anyways. So for example, here is a rendered image for a VR display that is just static. This is your standard stereo rendering, but we're actually tracking the eye in our case. And with the ocular parallax enabled, we have a gaze-contingent parallax effect that's very small. So it's not entirely clear if it actually affects the perceived image in any way or the depth. And that's what we set out to do. We prototyped the system. We ran a lot of user studies, and I'll just give you the executive summary. Turns out that ocular parallax rendering in VR is not only visible, but the effect size is the same as retinal blur. So this Vergence accommodation conflict I mentioned earlier, the ability of people to accommodate or not, has been investigated very heavily because people think that it's a very important thing to do in VR and AR. Well, it turns out that getting this micro parallax or this ocular parallax correct is equally important. And does this include increased perceptual realism? Yes, it does. Many people think that ocular parallax enabled VR rendering is more perceptually realistic than not doing it. One other impact that ocular parallax has is that if we think about not just a single eye, but both eyes, is that it actually affects the interpupillary distance. Now, the interpupillary distance is the distance between the two eyes. It slightly varies from person to person. On average, it's something like 64 millimeters. But again, it changes slightly from person to person. And typically, we dial this in as a fixed number into our VR headset. But it actually turns out that this ocular parallax effect creates a Vergence-dependent IPD. So if we look at an object that's far away, our eyes are parallel and the IPD is larger. than if we fixate an object that's closer. If we fixate an object that gets closer, our eyes will converge or verge, and the centers of projections actually shift closer together, and the effective IPD gets smaller. This effect is ignored in VR rendering today, and it leads, as we showed, to distortions of the perceived disparity values. So what that means is, in a nutshell, without necessarily walking you through all the numbers and plots in this slide, is that the depth rendering is distorting the content that we look at in conventional VR and AR displays. And what we demonstrated is that if you dial in ocular parallax rendering and adjust the IPD, the interpupillary distance, dynamically depending on the vergence distance, you can statistically significantly improve the depth perception in VR and AR. And what that means is if you render digital content on top of a physical object, it really stays world-locked where you want it rather than shifting around quite a bit. So this is important. The last topic I briefly want to touch upon is eye tracking. A lot of the techniques I mentioned earlier, varifocal displays, gaze-contingent rendering, also foveated rendering that I didn't talk about, rely on eye tracking. And eye tracking seems like a thing that is sort of solved, but it's not. Eye tracking doesn't work today very well. There are two different types of eye tracking systems. Eye tracking systems that are used for VR and AR, like Tobii, Pupil Labs, and others, they're fairly slow, running at 120 to 200 hertz, giving you an accuracy of 0.5 to 1 degrees in the best case scenario, but they sort of fail to be really robust. And they're not very power efficient either, and they're not very fast at all. And then you have these, research grade desk-mounted systems. For example, iLink. These are gold standard systems. They run over 1,000 hertz, have provide about the same accuracy. They can't be mounted close to the eye. They have dedicated chipsets that do this, and they're not really running at low power. But you can see that for vision science experiments, you want to have this speed, which is absolutely crucial. And why do you want it? Because some of the fastest eye movements, like microsaccades, are just very fast, and you don't want to lose the tracking. So microsaccades are fast, eye trackers are too slow, you lose the tracking, your gaze-contingent algorithms will fail. So what does it take to get a high frame rate system? And here we're just going to the extreme. Imagine a system that is supposed to run at 10,000 frames per second. Let's say an eye tracking camera is typically lower resolution, something on the order of 300 by 300 pixels. And it doesn't have to be color. So it's maybe 8 bits of data. So the bandwidth of a 10,000 frame per second system with 300 by 300 pixels and 8 bits for the one color channel, it would require a bandwidth of 7.2 gigabits per second. And that is way beyond what USB 3, for example, can deliver. Not that you'd use USB in this context, but just to give you a sense of the bandwidth required. It's impossible to do it really in a near-eye display system, just from a bandwidth perspective. But there's one really key insight is that an eye tracking camera is typically mounted close to your eye, and it doesn't move much with respect to your face. The only thing that really moves is the pupil and maybe the eyelids. So reading out a lot of data, it may not be necessary. For example, the typical perspective of an eye is shown on the left, but if you look at the temporal difference, like that, the actual changes in time on the right, you see that most of this data is sparse, as depicted in gray. So you actually really only need to capture the difference, what changes from one frame to the other. And it turns out that there is an emerging camera technology that's known as event-based vision or event-based sensors that can capture in hardware exactly these changes in time at a very high speed asynchronously. So these event-based sensors are ideal for eye tracking to some extent because they only capture exactly what changes, exactly when it changes. And they do that at very low power. So we've been exploring event-based eye tracking systems for a number of years now. You saw some event-based output in the last slide. Here, there's actually a couple of event-based sensor technologies that capture both frames at a lower frame rate and events in between the frames. So we experimented with that in this context. So what you can see is the individual frames captured at 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, and then these sparse events of the changes that happen in between at a much higher frame rate, basically asynchronously. We've been developing online fitting approaches to fit the pupil, the eyelid, the whole gaze vector also. So all of this can be done very fast, robustly, at up to 10,000 frames per second and beyond. So just to give you a sense of the pipeline, initially you saw the raw data coming off the event. Here you can see the fitted pupil. So now, between the two different frames, if you have a microsaccade, the pupil moves quite a bit. So we can robustly fit the pupil in over the microsecond and in between frames, which is typically not possible. Here's a little demo that we put together with one of our first systems where we had like benchtop set mounted system. The user now follows the mouse pointer and we just render basically what we're tracking. So this works very well, very robustly at very high speeds. Here's another view. You just ask the user to follow the mouse pointer and works very well in practice. We also implemented a first wearable prototype with that's actually, an actual near eye sort of form factor, and that worked also very well. So this is a really exciting technology that offers, robust, ultra low power, ultra fast, ultra small, also potentially eye tracking that is particularly well suited for AR. And I'm excited to help the team at Zyn Labs continue to commercialize this type of technology, where we look at eye tracking enabled AI technology and low power, high speed, low latency eye tracking in the form factor that you can see here. So thank you so much for your attention. Today, I hope I get you a little bit excited about some of the aspects of, human-centric technology development in the space of AR, VR, and wearable computing. My lab is called the Computational Imaging Lab because we actually work on a number of other topics, including end-to-end optimization of optics and image processing for cameras, work on computational cameras, active illumination for 3D imaging, work on microscopy, and also on neural scene representation, rendering, and generation. You can see on the lower right. So it's a mix of topics that all combine physics and AI in a meaningful way. So with this, I'd like to thank my students and postdocs and also our sponsors, and hopefully we have some time for Q&A. Thank you for your attention.